Players want to be scared. They load up a horror game knowing exactly what they're in for. They're watching for every jump scare, analyzing every footstep, preparing themselves for what's coming. So how do you scare someone who's already bracing for it? Some games figure it out, others fail completely. I found just about 5 principles that separate the good games from the bad, and I want you to explore them with me, starting with a game that is literally called F.E.A.R. Well, F.E.A.R 3 to be exact. The title is right there, and yet something went horribly wrong, and one player on Steam put it perfectly. Bland, repetitive gunplay, the scares are utterly terrible, and worst of all, predictable. No element of suspense or actual fear. The writing is terrible and convoluted, and it's not the only review of its kind. There are tons of them. Players spend the entire game regenerating health automatically, swimming in ammunition, and using special abilities of characters. Dead Space 3 had the same problem. Within the first 30 minutes, you could have your inventory completely maxed out with health and ammo. Oh yeah, and speaking of ammo, they also added a universal ammo system that meant you never had to make hard choices about what to conserve. You just add everything. Now, compare that to Alien Isolation. The game makes you spend just about 18 hours on a space station. There is no weapon that can kill the alien. You can craft flamethrowers, pipe bombs, noisemakers, but they only buy you time. The alien always comes back, and you can never, ever win a direct fight. Or Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Thomas Grip and his team at Frictional Games prototype versions with weapons. They had builds where you could find guns, and they cut all of it. Years later, Grip explained that gun gameplay is just not a good fit for horror. And he's right. Think about Dying Light or Dead Island. Technically horror games, zombie survival mechanics, the atmosphere is there, but the combat feels so good that you start hunting zombies. You go out looking for fights because the combat is satisfying. The moment you give players effective tools to fight back and combat becomes engaging and fun, fear evaporates. You stop being the victim, you become the hunter. Powerlessness should be the entire point of horror games, but even if you nail that, there's another way to completely destroy horror that's even more common. In 2021, a documentary came out about the making of F.E.A.R 3. Associate producer Chris Julian said something fascinating. So here's the question: why? Why does having another player destroy horror so completely that developers will literally tell you, we knew this wouldn't work, but we had to do it anyway? Because the best horror requires isolation, not just physically being alone, but feeling like there's no safety net. When you can call for backup, or when you can strategize together about how to tackle the next room, you're experiencing a challenge that you're going to overcome together, not horror. There are of course exceptions to this, as there are games out there that have co-op, but are still scary. But real top-of-the-line horror, you're gonna need some isolation. Look at what happened to Dead Space. The first game puts Isaac Clarke alone on the Ishimura. Nobody's coming for help. Every corner could be your last. By Dead Space 3, they added co-op with Carver as your buddy. The game became Gears of War in space. Same thing happened to Resident Evil. By the time you get to Resident Evil 5 or 6, you've got partner AI following you everywhere. The isolation is gone. But Outlast, you're alone with nothing but a camcorder. Resident Evil 7, Ethan isolated in the Baker house. Alien Isolation, 18 hours on the Sevastopol with no backup coming. Even when these games include NPCs, they use them sparingly. When you finally do see another person, it actually means something. Dead Space 1 terrified people. Dead Space 3 with co-op became an action game with horror aesthetics. The moment you can share the burden with someone else, you've broken the fundamental requirement of horror, and publishers keep learning this lesson over and over again. So you've made your player powerless. You've isolated them completely. They're alone, vulnerable, with no way to fight back effectively. But you still got a problem, because players are problem solvers. And if your scares follow a pattern, they'll learn that pattern. They'll optimize it. And once they know exactly when the monsters appear or what triggers the jump scare, the fear evaporates. Wind back to 2014, when the indie horror scene is drowning in Slender clones. Run around, collect pages, something chases you, repeat. Players get exhausted by the formula. Then Scott Cawthon released Five Nights at Freddy's, a game where you can't run. You're locked in an office. You have doors, lights, cameras. That's it. And somehow, this game, where you're completely immobile, becomes one of the most terrifying experiences players have had at that time. Cawthon figured out that the scariest moment isn't the jump scare itself, it's the 10 seconds before it. The growing dread as you hear footsteps in the hallway. The panic when you check the camera and Bonnie isn't where he's supposed to be. The split-second decision about whether to close the door or save power. PC Gamer called it a less is more experience, where fear stemmed more from anticipation than direct threats. You're scared because Freddy might jump at you, and you have no idea when. But scripted scares bring their own challenges. Take any horror game where the monster always spawns in at the same hallway at the same time. First playthrough, terrifying. Second playthrough, you know it's coming. Third time you die and respawn at that checkpoint, it's just an obstacle. The scare has become a pattern, and you need to execute correctly to progress. Even FNAF itself faced this. Critics noted that once you memorize the jump scare patterns, they became repetitive. The scares work once, maybe twice, then they're just checkpoints you have to pass. So how do you solve this? Look at Resident Evil 7. Jack Baker stalking you through the Baker house. He doesn't follow his script. He can burst through walls. You can hear his footsteps and have no idea if he's actually coming for you or just patrolling. The game creates this constant dread because you never know when he'll show up. Same with Alien Isolation's dual brain AI. The director AI always knows where you are, but it doesn't tell the alien directly. It only gives vague directional hints. The alien hunts through its own limited senses, creating encounters that surprised even the developers during playtesting. The innovation is in making you constantly uncertain about whether something will jump at you and when. Unpredictable systems keep players scared because they can't learn the pattern. The alien might show up in 5 minutes or 30 seconds. Jack Baker might be in the next room or 3 floors away. You never know when. But what if you took this further? What if players couldn't even trust what they were seeing? Someone knocks on your door. It's the middle of night. Solar radiation has made daytime lethal. You look through the peephole at a tired face asking for shelter. The news this morning said visitors, creatures from the underground that mimic humans, are showing up at people's homes. They gave you warning signs, exaggerated features, odd speech patterns, specific behavioral tells. The person at your door has some of those signs. Not all of them, some. Do you open the door? No, I'm Not Human came out this year and immediately hit 98% positive reviews. The entire game is this moment repeated over and over. Different people, different tells, and rules that are technically true, but have exceptions. A character displays every warning sign of being a visitor. It turns out they're just being weird and desperate. Another seems perfectly normal, tears in their eyes, begging, and the moment you open the door, you're dead. The game's hyper-detailed art style deliberately plays with proportions, so you can't tell if what you're seeing is a monster's disguise or just an unusual person. One reviewer put it perfectly: nothing you were told is incorrect, but they all have exceptions. Alien Isolation made you uncertain about when the threat would appear. FNAF made you dread what was coming, but No, I'm Not Human makes you uncertain about reality itself. You stop trusting the information you're given. You stop trusting your own perception. Every decision becomes paralysis because you don't know if you're being cautious or paranoid. So far, we've talked about different kinds of uncertainty, when the threat will appear, what the threat even is, whether you can trust your own perception. But there's a more fundamental kind of terror, one that is scattered throughout most of the games we've already talked about, but haven't directly commented on just yet. Can you figure out what it is? I'll give you 5 seconds to think while we look at some silly gooses. Sorry, had to do it. But still, what did Alien Isolation and Dead Space 1 do differently compared to Dead Space 3? It's resources. And they're not the only game that are great at it. Picture this: you're standing in a dark dungeon, and you have a bone saw in your inventory. Your companion's leg is infected, tetanus is setting in. If you don't amputate now, they'll die in the next few hours. But you also know there are herbs deeper in the dungeon that could cure the infection without amputation. Maybe. You're not sure where they are. You're not even sure if they exist in this particular run. Do you use the bone saw now, or do you risk waiting? This is Fear and Hunger, an RPG Maker horror game that looks like it has no business being terrifying. Turn-based combat, random encounters, pixel art, and yet it creates a specific kind of dread that most horror games never touch. The game is built on resource anxiety. You have a hunger meter that is constantly depleting, a sanity meter that drops in the dark, healing items are scarce, weapons break, and critically, many of the game's essential items and events are determined by coin flips. Literally, the game will ask you to call heads or tails, and if you're wrong, you die. Or you lose a limb, or maybe miss a crucial item. Developer Miro Havarinen designed this deliberately. He wanted to create relentless darkness and experiment with evoking helplessness. Every decision becomes agonizing because you never have enough of anything. Do you spend your mind points on a skill or keep them to maintain sanity? Do you eat your only piece of bread or risk starvation? The game is brutally, almost unfairly difficult, but that unfairness is the point. When you're never sure if you have enough to survive, every step forward feels like a risk. Every item you use feels like a gamble. F.E.A.R 1 was scary. F.E.A.R 3 wasn't. Dead Space 1 terrified people. Dead Space 3 became Gears of War in space. Resident Evil built a franchise on tension and dread, and by Resident Evil 6, it was a globe-trotting action spectacle. Every single time, the pattern is identical. Publisher sees a successful horror game. Publisher wants a bigger audience. They add co-op because co-op was hot. They increase the action because players need to feel empowered. They give you more ammo, more weapons, more abilities, and every single time, the horror dies. All of these principles we've talked about, powerlessness, isolation, unpredictability, unreliable information, resource scarcity, they all point to the same thing. Horror games work when players feel complicit in their own terror. It's not about the monster. It's about the fact that you checked the motion tracker even though you knew it would make noise. You opened the door even though the person seemed wrong. You used the medkit early and now you don't have one when you really need it. You decided to keep going instead of turning back. The moment you give players too much power, let them bring a friend which allows them to revive each other, or the moment the combat becomes fun, you're removing their agency as a participant in their own fear. You're turning them back into a viewer, and viewers can't be scared the same way participants can. Now, if you want to scare them even further, you're gonna need lore. Good lore, but how do you write that? Click here to find out. Thanks for watching.